Welcome to CSIS and this webinar on inclusive innovation. Innovation is the process of turning research ideas into products for the marketplace. And it is, in fact, the engine that powers our economy, drives our global competitiveness, and ensures our national security. And these features have not been unobserved elsewhere. China's Xi Jinping has observed that science and technology innovation has become a critical support for increasing comprehensive national strength. He adds that whoever holds the key to S&T innovation will be able to preempt the rivals and win the advantages of a global competition. So to remain in this competition, the US needs to bring both demographic as well as geographic diversity into the knowledge economy of the 21st century. This is why inclusive innovation is so important. While we have long celebrated American inventiveness and entrepreneurship, its impact in recent decades has been uneven. Many in our nation see themselves as being left behind by new and transformative technologies. So connecting our communities into the broader innovations ecosystem is necessary to create a shared stake in our common prosperity as a nation. It's also how we will need to compete in the global landscape of the 21st century. So to address these issues, CSIS is bringing together today two panels of experts to describe the challenges and paths forward towards a more inclusive and vibrant innovation ecosystem. The first panel will be moderated by Tom Guevara, who directs Indiana University's Public Policy Institute. Tom was previously Assistant Secretary for Economic Development at the U.S. Department of Commerce. He is now a senior advisor to the CSIS Renewing American Innovation Project. And Tom's panel will answer the question of why inclusion is important for innovation, as well as the opportunity and challenges of growing an inclusive ecosystem. The second panel will be moderated by Andre Iancu, a founder of the innovation program here at CSIS. He previously served as the Undersecretary for Commerce for Intellectual Property and the Director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Among Andre's initiatives at USPTO was the creation of the National Council for Expanding American Innovation. This is a group of industry, academia, and government leaders tasked with helping the USPTO develop a comprehensive national strategy to broaden participation in the innovation ecosystem demographically, geographically, and economically. Andre's panel will take a close look at the role and impacts of the industry and the patent system in encouraging a more diverse innovation system. So it is at the end important to note that inclusive innovation is not just a moral imperative, but also has a competitive purpose and a national security imperative as well. The American innovation system is important for our nation's economic growth across its regions and across its demographics. And in an era of increased strategic and technology-based competition, the US needs to expand its innovation ecosystem while strengthening the pillars on which it rests. So it's now my pleasure to welcome Tom Guevara to introduce and moderate the first panel. Tom?
Thank you, Sujai. And the title of this panel is The Challenges of Inclusion. With me today are three very talented and exceptional panelists who will give their perspectives on the various challenges of inclusion, particularly for those individuals who we don't normally consider as part of our inclusion economy, or for other reasons have suffered disparities or have been otherwise disconnected from opportunities to participate in the high-tech economy. So our first speaker, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to give brief introductory remarks, is Dr. Amisha Campbell, and then she will be followed by Victor Huang, and then finally Dr. Catherine Ashcraft. Dr. Amisha Campbell currently serves as Assistant Vice President for Research and Economic Development and Director of Technology Transfer and Commercialization at Jackson State University. She supports the overall direction of the Division of Research and Economic Development, which includes sponsored programs, grants, contracts administration, research compliance, federal relations, technology transfer, and commercialization. She also manages the intellectual property process from triage of invention disclosures to commercialization. She provides strategic direction and vision for defining partnerships in research, commercialization, entrepreneurship and innovation initiatives between Jackson State and other institutions, funding agencies, and industry stakeholders. Dr. Campbell is the incoming chair of the board of the Association of University Technology Managers. She also is a board member of Innovate Mississippi and of the Bean Path nonprofit organization. She also is a member of the Licensing Executive Society, the American Society of Public Administration, and an honorary member of the National Academy of Inventors. She co-founded Global Equity and Diversity in Technology Transfer to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion in technology transfer across the globe. Dr. Campbell received her bachelor's degree from the University of Central Florida, a master's degree in mass communications, and a doctor of philosophy degree in public administration, in public policy and administration from Jackson State University. Following her will be Victor Huang. Victor is an economic growth expert whose ideas have shaped the economic lives of millions worldwide. He is founder and CEO of Victor & Company, a consultancy that builds modern economies by accelerating innovation and catalyzing entrepreneurship. He is also founder and CEO of Right to Start, a national campaign fighting to make entrepreneurial opportunity available for everyone, with a network reaching over 25 communities. Previously, Victor was Vice President of Entrepreneurship at the Kauffman Foundation, the world's leading philanthropy supporting entrepreneurs, where he led initiatives that impacted more than 200,000 entrepreneurs. His projects included efforts in catalyzing capital formation, transforming economic development practices, launching a national policy roadmap, and breaking barriers for underserved entrepreneurs. Victor himself is a serial entrepreneur and investor who has started and helped grow multiple companies, an author whose book, The Rainforest, was named Book of the Year, a columnist in Inc., Bloomberg, The Hill, Make, and other media, and a former corporate lawyer. He has testified in Congress and multiple state legislature. He graduated from Harvard University and the University of Chicago Law School. And then our final panelist will be Dr. Catherine Ashcraft. She is a director of research and senior research scientist with NCWIT, where she oversees all research and resource development for K-12, post-secondary, and industry contexts. She directs change initiatives for NCWIT's Workforce Alliance and has extensive experience working with senior executives to create inclusive cultures. Dr. Ashcraft also has taught and presented at national and international venues on these topics for the past 15 years and has worked with a variety of government entities, advocating for CS, IT, and CT education and workplace policy. Dr. Ashcraft has served as a principal investigator on several research grants. In her role at NCWIT, she employs a unique blend of research and practice, overseeing primary research projects and translating that research into practical resources that organizations can use for diversifying their technology workforce and for creating more inclusive technology workplaces. Dr. Ashcraft oversees NCWIT's effort to translate organizational research into practical resources organizations can use to create inclusive cultures. She also presents regularly on issues related to diversity and technology and has published widely in top academic journals and applied venues. She also directs reform initiatives for NCWIT's Workforce Alliance, a consortium of leading global technology companies and departments, and works with senior executives to implement these initiatives. Before coming to NCWIT, Catherine was an assistant professor of multicultural education and director of diversity learning at Western Washington University. So with that, I will then turn it over to Dr. Campbell. Dr. Campbell, if you would like to give us a few introductory comments on the challenges of inclusion.
Thank you, Tom. I must say it's a pleasure to be on this panel with my distinguished colleagues. I'm happy to be here and to talk about a topic that I've been uniquely involved with for the last 9 or so years. For me, I saw at an early age how inclusion in the innovation ecosystem is important because we have diverse voices. And oftentimes, the people that tend to be marginalized are left out of the ecosystem, left out of the conversation within those ecosystems. And so involving them, I often feel like they're the best people to tell us what those solutions can be to help solve some of the problems that they are experiencing in their communities. So for me, inclusion is important for innovation because it provides opportunities for collaboration among all members of an organization or ecosystem. And so when these people participate in projects involving innovation, you see where success increases. This has been a proven fact. Because when people feel included, they're better able to contribute to a group and the society without fear of being ostracized. So by bringing these ideas forward, they are offering a particular perspective that are unique to them and that stems from a completely different background. The best innovation and outcomes often come from those environments where diverse perspectives from people trying to solve the same problem. So you have people from their lived experiences telling you what some of those challenges are. They just want to be a part of the solution to help them. Inclusion is also important because it allows those who are impacted to be a part of development of those solutions, as I said before, and it helps solve the experience that they have in their communities. It helps upskill them in order for them to understand what's happening to them. It helps them also to work with others in solving their issues. So that those diverse ideas and those diverse opportunities really empowers these type of communities to do better, to live better, and to have different experiences. The diversity of perspective is unique because of the lived experiences of the people. It supports and encourages innovation in big ways and also in small ways. And there's data to back this up. There's data to show that inclusive cultures are 6 times more likely to be innovative. It ensures that these marginalized members, whether they're people with disabilities, people from different ethnic backgrounds, people of different gender, sexual orientation, that they're not told that they're included. But when they see that they're included and can be a part of the solution, they tend to be more excited. They tend to be able to give some other perspectives that others may not readily view because they're not in those spaces that they live 24/7. And indeed, when organizations truly invest in these processes, inclusion unlocks potential. So the investment and the intentional investment into these systems and processes allows innovation and inclusion to really ramp up. And I feel that it is important for us to offer those opportunities to bring all the diverse voices to the table. I often have a saying is that if I get into a room and everyone speaks like me and accepts everything that I say, I'm turning my back and walking out of the room. I need people to challenge me. I need people to be able to bring different perspectives to the conversation so we can solve the problem more innovatively. And so that's what I want to bring to the conversation today about why inclusion is important to innovation.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn it over to Victor Huang. Victor, if you could give us a few introductory comments.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. So I'll start with some good news, and then I'll go into the bad news. I think the good news is that entrepreneurship has been going through a transformation over the last few years. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of new people who've decided to start businesses, whether they saw opportunity or whether they did it because they lost prior jobs during the pandemic. There was a huge rush in. And so we've seen spikes in entrepreneurship across the entire country. We've seen, even before the pandemic started, we were seeing a rise in entrepreneurship amongst Black entrepreneurs. Hispanic entrepreneurs have actually been more active in starting new businesses than almost any other subgroup within the United States. We've seen a huge amount of attention in the last few years paid to entrepreneurship access. We've seen funding increases to support programming from Economic Development Administration out of congressional funding. We've seen new capital access initiatives. We've seen a huge amount of interest and attention into expanding new funds getting built for women entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs, Hispanic entrepreneurs, a wide variety of people who've been left out of the system before. So there's a lot of good news and a lot of great attention and a lot of credit to be paid and attributed to people who've been involved in helping reshuffle that landscape. Now, the bad news is a bigger story, which is that we have a system that's actually increasingly rigid and ossified, and actually has been stifling entrepreneurial activity for decades now. And these recent shifts that have been happening are good, but they're still small compared to the broader narrative that's happening. And as we're coming out of the pandemic and as the country has been rebooting itself, we're finding that a lot of the old inequities have actually remained the same. And so I'll start out with some data that not everybody believes when I say it, which is that entrepreneurship has actually been in decline in America since the late 1970s. This goes as far back as the US Census tracks it. But if you go back to the 1970s and you look at the percentage of young businesses within the economy as a percentage of all businesses, we've actually fallen by half. There's actually about almost half the rate of entrepreneurial activity today that there was back in the late 70s. In addition, when you poll entrepreneurs and you ask them, is the system fair to you? 81% of entrepreneurs say the system is tilted and that government favors large incumbent businesses instead of them. 69% of entrepreneurs say the system doesn't care about them at all. And the data bears that out. If you actually look at, for instance, new entrants in government contracting, so federal procurement, just one example of how the systems actually allow for new entrepreneurs to break into the system. There's been a 79% decline in new entrants in federal contracting over the last couple decades. There has been almost half the rate of rural entrepreneurship today that there was a generation ago. We've seen massive drop-offs in entrepreneurial activity. And so the question is, how could this possibly be? Because when you look at the news, you watch television, you hear stories of entrepreneurship, it seems like America is booming. There's so much entrepreneurial activity and access, and you hear stories of great success. And what's happened is entrepreneurship has actually become a privileged activity that favors certain parts of the population over others. And this has been increasingly the case, especially if you start to look at the data around geography, demographics, socioeconomic scales. That is, the inequality that we've talked about in general across the population has actually become inequality in access to entrepreneurial opportunity as well. And so this issue of inclusion is actually core to the American economic experience, because entrepreneurship is actually core to everything we care about in economies. So a lot of people will say, well, you know, how important could entrepreneurship be? We've got big companies that provide great goods and services to us. Why do you need more entrepreneurs when you have the basic needs addressed by a lot of large businesses? And the answer is, if you look at the research and the data, this is like, you know, NBER research that shows that over 2 decades, that almost all net job growth in an economy comes from the young businesses. That is, older businesses shed jobs over time, or net zero in jobs over time. If you want new job growth over time, the net aggregate effect of that comes from young businesses. That is entrepreneurial dynamism, new business creation. And so if you don't have young businesses getting created over time, your economy will shed jobs. And it makes sense because large businesses, incumbent businesses, are in the business of maximizing profits. And when you maximize profits, the only ways to do that are to create new products and services that are highly innovative, or you shed costs. And one of the biggest cost structures in any company is jobs, it's people, it's staffing. And so over time, big companies tend to do that. They tend to maximize profits by cutting jobs because they get leaner and meaner and more efficient at what they do, which is kind of what they're supposed to be doing. And so we can't necessarily blame them because they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, but we should blame ourselves for creating a system that's actually been stifling the new entrants and the entrepreneurs in the system. And so we know that entrepreneurs create new jobs, almost all net jobs. We know they raise incomes. So more entrepreneurs in a system actually they may actually make more money in their lifetimes. Entrepreneurs, people who start businesses, make about 10% more over their lifetimes. They make less in the early years of starting, but over their lifetimes, they make more. We know that more entrepreneurial activity raises community incomes. That is, for every 1% increase in entrepreneurial activity in a county, it raises average household income by over $400 a household. We know it lowers poverty and inequality. For every 1% increase in entrepreneurial activity in a state, there's a corresponding 2% decrease in poverty in a state. We know it also creates GDP. They can actually track where GDP comes from. And it's the young businesses that generate the innovative products and services that end up becoming the GDP growth of the future. So all these things point to the fact that entrepreneurial activity is critical to the future prosperity of America. But it also points to the fact that if it's not inclusive, that is, if we're leaving out large swaths of our population, then we're actually leaving money on the table. We're actually not taking full advantage of our entire talent and skill base of the economy. And the data bears that out. That is, entrepreneurship has been struggling. It's been in decline in many parts of the population. And we can actually do something about it. There's actually ways to tackle this issue, which is why I created this organization, Right to Start. And it is a national organization focused on lifting entrepreneurship as a priority across the country in our civic debate, in our public debate, in our policy debate. And I'm excited to talk more about that as we go along.
Thank you very much, Victor. And now I'll turn to Dr. Catherine Ashcraft for a few opening comments.
And thank you, Tom. And it's also a pleasure to be here and on this panel with my colleagues as well. I'm going to actually, I think, do the opposite of Victor and start with the bad news and then end with the good news. And also, I apologize, my voice is a little bit raspy here and there. I may be needing to refresh with this water. But I wanted to focus today on my remarks on kind of 5 key challenges that we've identified in our 15 years of work with industry partners, both entrepreneurial companies and larger organizations. And we've identified 5 challenges that are thwarting kind of existing diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. There's typical pitfalls that organizations can fall into and mistakes they can make. And so I want to look at those briefly so that we can not repeat the mistakes of the past and think about how to address those moving forward. But first, just a little context on what we do at NCWIT, the National Center for Women in IT. Our mission is to increase the meaningful and influential participation of girls and women in computing and technology. And by that, it's important to note that we mean women in all the ways that they vary in different terms of different intersectional identities when it comes to race, ethnicity, gender expression, sexual orientation, all of those types of different intersecting identities. And I also want to, as we work with hundreds of organizations across the so-called pipeline, both K-12, higher ed, and industry. But my focus as Director of Research is working closely with our industry partners and helping them create inclusive cultures. And I also wanted to call attention to the phrase in our mission, meaningful and influential participation, because this actually leads, I think, to one of the first of the 5 challenges I want to just briefly mention. And that is that there is often not a distinction between participation, presence in the industry or field, versus meaningful and influential participation. What you're able to actually do, to what extent are you actually able to contribute to innovation and influence team decision-making, all of those kinds of important dynamics in the company. And that is so often overlooked. And I think this is really key for the subject of innovation, because that's where innovation happens. And if we're not paying attention to what people are able to do once they're in entrepreneurial or other kinds of organizations, we don't really have a handle on the extent to which they are actually able to contribute to innovation. And it's possible, and we have lots of evidence to suggest that marginalized groups tend to get sequestered in less powerful roles or less influential roles. And so paying attention to that is really important. And to date, most companies or organizations focus primarily on headcount and measuring who is in the demographics of people in the occupations. But we have very few metrics, although we are working on developing some, and there's exciting work being done in this space of trying to get a handle on the extent to which people are able to actually contribute to innovation. So we've developed some tools to help people look at power dynamics on their teams, or to look at, the next panel focuses on patenting. I think that's also a really important place to focus and look at who has access to those kinds of ways of influencing innovation. The second key pitfall is, especially, this is true in both large organizations as well as entrepreneurial organizations, but business and technical leaders tend to not think that it's their job to create inclusive cultures. They tend to abdicate the responsibility to HR or DEI professionals or somebody else, right? And so we really emphasize the importance of the senior leaders, business technical leaders, taking ownership and accountability for it and working on it in the day-to-day basis, because otherwise the culture won't change. And the third pitfall is, and I'm sure many of you experienced this, is that a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts over the years have tended to be episodic in nature. And they're piecemeal kind of one-off solutions, or they're reactionary in response to kind of a social movement or crisis. But once the furor dies down, then the momentum dies down. And they are not connected to a larger strategy. So you see this all the time, and such a common pitfall. And so avoiding that and trying to shift to a more systemic strategic mindset is really important. The fourth challenge is, and I'm just racing through these, so we can talk more about them later. But the fourth challenge is that often when engaged in diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, there's a rush to scale or to try to find the one-size-fit-all formula that we can just apply blankets to the whole organization or to every diversity and inclusion problem we face. And so this is, we like to call this, especially since we work with technical companies in the industry, it's a kind of a misapplication of algorithmic thinking, right? Trying to find the algorithm that you can just plug and play and scale to the whole organization. And this can really damage rather than advance some diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And it's important to kind of take the time to allow bake time and to allow kinds of things to percolate and infuse the DNA of the company. And finally, the last one that I wanted to mention, the last challenge, because this is also so common, is that companies or organizations of all kinds tend to focus on when they advance diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, they focus on what we call fix the person approaches. And those are kind of rather than fixing the system, let's say. And so, if you've heard of women should go and get some better negotiation skills or negotiation training or learn to be more confident and assertive. Those kinds of things all of that can be good professional development, right? But it's never going to change the system. And so but these are so popular, right? And it becomes the default often, and no attention is given to the system. So that is what we are working on. Is the good news now, because that was maybe some of the sort of depressing news. The good news is we know a lot of ways to avoid these pitfalls. And so there are a lot of tools and resources we and other folks are developing to help shift the mindset of organizations and others engaged in this work from these kinds of one-off episodic approaches to more systemic strategic changes. And there are lots of, I think, exciting ways to be able to do that. And we're seeing exciting progress in a number of our industry partners. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Tom.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you for some really poignant opening remarks. So what I'd like to do is just kick off this conversation across all of you, but I'll start with you, Dr. Campbell, and certainly your introductory remarks went to this issue, but I guess maybe if we could synthesize an overall assessment of the state of inclusive innovation in America today. Are you seeing opportunities for people of color, people who live outside metro areas, and people of other diverse backgrounds to participate in the development of America's high-tech economy? If so, where? What are people doing that's making that happen?
That's a good question, Tom. I'm definitely in the space I'm in. I'm seeing a lot of that. I'm seeing efforts in creating a more inclusive innovation system, especially for marginalized communities. But it goes back to some of the challenges that Catherine mentioned, a few minutes ago. We see where people come into the communities and they say, hey, we want to help you do something. And the minute you said yes, then the next time it's all automatically, oh, can we get more schools involved, or can we get more people involved, without really measuring the success of that first iteration of whatever that is, whether it's a project, a program. There's not enough effort put in to see if this is really working, or seeing if the people that are in the community truly understand, are learning from it, right? And so we get that rush to scale that Catherine talked about, and I smile throughout that because I see that a lot. The other challenge I see is the people are trying to help, and they're thinking without talking to the people that are in those ecosystems, and they're developing programs, and they're coming in now and saying, hey, Dr. Campbell, please send me your founders or your best this or your best that, right? And my answer is always like very straightforward. Where am I going to find them? Because you didn't help me cultivate them, right? So the part about growing them and cultivating and helping with that entrepreneurial mindset is oftentimes missing at the basic level. And so the expectation, especially, and I'm speaking from a historically Black college and university perspective, and the communities which I serve, I'm getting, can you send me the people in your communities that are ready to do SBIR and are ready to do this? We have this program, we're trying to make it more inclusive. Well, there's still a lot of work to be done on the lower level, which is why I said that maybe part of my job would be to help create that and get them ready. But I think if there's more investment in those nascent stages, in helping those communities, it would be better, because they lack the resources that's needed to even get to that level of readiness that most of these programs need them to be. One of the things I find that those that are creating fellowship opportunities and internship opportunity into these spaces and allowing the students and the faculty and the staff to really work side by side with the people that are successful doing it, I find those programs are even better for our ecosystem, because they get to see it in real time. They get to operate, sorry, that's my phone vibrating across from me. Turned everything off except that, sorry. So I find those, and this is me being in this space for, 14 years and seeing it, but it has changed because, one, we're now seeing more opportunities that might just be mismatched. We're now seeing more conversations such as this one, which is great. We're now seeing where they're including us a part of the conversation and at the table. And the start of it is really those conversations, right? And so if we're not having those conversations, then the opportunity for being inclusive is not going to be there. So I'm grateful for those opportunities to have these type of conversations. And I'll just go back from Autumn, that I'm going to be the first person of color becoming chair at the end of February. But when we started, I was a part of the organization for 10 years, and I've been able to see the growth in terms of DEI within that organization and how it grew over time, and how the processes and practices and everything that we're doing is intentional, from our strategic plan to our programming, to everything we do to make sure that it's strategic. So everything we do has to be strategic. And I'll wrap it up by saying, yes, it is changing. Yes, we need to have more people in different spaces, whether it's people with disabilities, women, people of color, different ethnic backgrounds, people of sexual orientation. Bring them a part of the conversation, bring them to the table, and then allow their voices to be heard. And I think we're going to get there a little bit faster if those diverse voices are at the table, because they do have something to contribute. They just have not been given a lot of the opportunities to be at the table.
Great, thank you. Catherine, do you have a comment on that? I know she mentioned some of the work in your comments.
Yeah, I loved so much of that, Amisha, that you were saying resonates so much. I think, especially I wanted to echo the point you were making about long-term solutions or the people that come to you and ask for, send us the people that are ready for us to employ, or that sort of thing. And without making the long-term investment, I think that is, again, points to this overall kind of push for short solutions. Like, I want the 5 steps to fix my company culture, or I want the 5 steps to find the people I need to diversify, without putting in sort of the investment. And the other thing that I would, just having the patience for developing and cultivating those long-term kind of relationships. And the other thing I would add to that, I think, is that in terms of industry partners as well, it is important for them to invest in the development of the future workforce, but also they sometimes do that in neglect of their own cultures in their own organizations. And so it's very important for them to be working on their own cultures and not always push. Sometimes it ends up with the blame kind of being pushed down the so-called pipeline, right? And then they don't attend to their own cultures. And then what happens is even if you're successfully bring a diverse workforce in, it will end up leaving or not being, a part of that belonging that Amisha was talking about before.
Thank you. Victor, you had mentioned, of course, and given us a very nice overview too of the state of entrepreneurship, but are you also seeing anything that is on the ground that's promising with respect to building a more inclusive opportunities?
We are. There is a movement afoot, and we've been part of this at Right to Start, to actually lift entrepreneurship access and inclusivity into the public debate. So in this year, we actually had 5 states introduce Right to Start Act legislation. We're gearing up for 10 states next year to introduce it at the state legislative level. And this is really about expanding broad-based entrepreneurial access for everybody, so everybody gets a fair shot at this. And if you think about the problem, the question is, some people will ask is, well, why does it matter? And the problem is, we have, like Almisha and Catherine were saying, you have situations where people want to start businesses, but they don't even know the first steps on how to do it. And we've ended up with a system where you can actually go through, K through 12 education, you can go through a great 4-year college education, and then you actually don't even know the first thing about how to go into business. And if you think about, what is a more natural human activity than value creation? To find a problem, to make a solution for it, and to make a living out of it should be one of the simplest, most basic skills of our educational system that we provide, but we actually have not taught that. And so we've actually got an educational system that actually has been built up around industrial era skills training for corporate job placement. And so you can see this in the entire workforce training system that's been built up. So about $13 billion a year is spent by the federal government to do workforce training through the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. That goes to the states, which goes to the local cities. All of that, almost all that money goes towards job skills to place people in existing corporate jobs. Almost zero of it goes to teaching people how to create their own jobs and create their own enterprise value and make their own living. And so no one even questions it. It's just sort of accepted that that's workforce training. Workforce training is job skills for large corporations. And so that model has to shift, which is if anything, the 21st century is about entrepreneurial nimbleness and innovation. And we have not actually built an educational system that's kept up with that. So schools are starting to change this. For instance, I was recently on a road trip across America visiting entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial communities and trying to see what's happening. And one of my stops was in West Virginia. I visited Huntington, West Virginia, and I met with Brad Smith. Brad Smith is the former CEO of Intuit, which runs, of course, famous programs like TurboTax and QuickBooks. But he left Intuit after being CEO for 11 years, and he moved back to West Virginia as a native son to take over the presidency of Marshall University, which is his alma mater, where he went to college, great public university. But what he's done in just being president there for under a year is he's already requiring every freshman in the mandatory curriculum at Marshall University to learn financial literacy and design thinking. And financial literacy being, how do you manage money? How do you deal with money? How do you create money? Where does money come from? And 2, design thinking, which is how do you solve problems with what you have without having to have anyone fix it for you? What do you take with the environment you have, with the resources you have, with the wherewithal you have to actually solve a problem and find creative solutions for it? Which is, design thinking is the recipe that Silicon Valley defined and perfected. And now he's brought that from Silicon Valley, and he's actually teaching his kids how to do that. And I asked him, why are you doing that, Brad? And he said, I want them to be scrappy. The world keeps changing. It's always throwing up new challenges in the way. We need to have students today that graduate that are able to tackle any problem that's thrown in front of them. And I actually met students there who've been through design thinking, and they said it just transformed their lives because these were people that felt like these problems were insurmountable. And when you give them a entrepreneurial framing model on how to tackle problems, it actually completely changes the way they view the world. And this is part of the transformation that needs to happen within our system, which is entrepreneurial skills need to become part of the way we think of everything we do. And it's not just education. It's not just reform about tax law or regulations, which is often what people think about, or subsidizing entrepreneurial activity, which is all part of the bigger picture. But it's around economic development practices, it's workforce training, it's patent law, it's the way K through 12 is done, it's the way higher education is done, it's the way regulations and red tape are handled, it's capital access, it's banking laws. It's sort of an endless list of things that touch upon entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurship is affected by everything and entrepreneurs affect everything. So we need to stop thinking of entrepreneurial innovation as a silo, and we need to think of it as a lens by which all aspect of economic life and governance is viewed through. And I think that's the shift that's happening right now, and it needs to continue to happen. It needs to be a front and center issue in the American debate.
Great, thank you. I want to take that theme a little bit, particularly your example from Marshall University, and come over to you, Catherine, and ask, is there anything that we need to do? Well, let me preface this by saying, of course, we always hear from businesses about the skills gap, and I think Victor alluded to that a bit in his comments, and sometimes we need also businesses to do more, and I think sort of Almisha sort of also touched on that just a bit. But I think when I think about, again, particularly individuals, whether they're women, people of color, people of diverse, other diverse backgrounds, requiring training and needing training access, what is there anything that we need to do differently in terms of preparing these individuals to participate in the skilled workforce and meet the need and the demand that's coming from high-tech industries?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question and complex. And the skills gap is definitely always a complicated conversation, right? And I do think that it is sometimes on business and other avenues to put more investment in that. I think there are lots of, I think Almisha actually touched on a couple of really important things when working with training people up into those kinds of skills. And that is really getting to know the community you're working in and getting to listen to their voices and bringing them in on the effort so that it's not like a top-down sort of effort, or again, so that it doesn't like take on the sort of feel of a fix the person kind of approach, like I mentioned before, like a deficit kind of model. So I think sometimes programs go in with like a deficit approach. And so that is something that I think could be changed. And then I think, again, because also I work so often with the organizations themselves, with either the VCs or the entrepreneurs or the bigger organizations, I think we miss an opportunity if we're just looking at diversity and inclusion through the lens of bringing in more diverse people and training them up for those jobs. But we miss the other lens about training the people in power or educating the people in power how to create an inclusive entrepreneurial organization from the beginning. Then we're going to miss the boat, or it's going to be a futile effort. And so I think that's really important, is to look at ways that you can educate VCs and other entrepreneurial contexts, incubators, all those kinds of things, providing resources. Because also the thing we like to emphasize when we do work with smaller companies and startups is that this is the best time. You're going to create a culture by default or by design. Back to the design thinking idea. And so, but you are at the very beginning stages of it. You don't have to undo years of like, as a big business would, of entrenched culture, right? You're creating it from the ground up. So it's a real opportunity.
Great, thank you. Almisha.
Yeah, I will add on to that and said, I think one of the things that I've seen in a couple of the programs that I've created is the language used. It's very simple, but sometimes we use a lot of acronyms and terminologies that some of these communities are not familiar with because they're not accustomed to be in that space. And so we have to be mindful of some of those things, right? Also, I think in creating a roadmap that is understandable to them about the next steps. So where do we have to go? Something as simple as that sometimes is often missed. Like people would come in and said, for example, yesterday I had someone call me, I'm a student. Hey, I'm interested in, I have something I think is patentable. I'd like to go ahead and intern or shadow a patent attorney. And then I start breaking it down. What is exactly you trying to do? And I said, you don't really need to intern or shadow a patent attorney. You can actually come to my office. I can walk you through the steps. I can provide you the tools and opportunity. So that person was coming from the perspective that in order to have a patent, I have to have, get the skill set of a patent attorney, which you don't have to have, right? You have to know it. First of all, you have to make sure that you've done the assessment, make sure that you do prior art searches, make sure you have something that's truly patentable, right? Before you even go to that step. But those are some of the things that I find in some of the programs. And then oftentimes the exclusion of students. in some of these programs, especially when it comes to a university. We often think, okay, we're going to go to the faculty, or in the community, we're going to go to the person that's already have a business. But what about those people who don't and just have a simple idea, right? They don't know how to take that idea and get it to the next level. And so we have to be intentional about focusing on some of that. And then oftentimes we do things and we think that people with disabilities understand, or that they can operate in a certain space without the tools and resources to do things. And we forget sometimes that we have to make these opportunities available to them and make sure they have the tools and resources in order to participate. Like my colleague Catherine said, it's a loaded question because it's a tried and true thing. It's trial and error, and then pivoting and then fixing some things. But I think the biggest thing that I see is that it has to be collaborative. I don't think any one institution or any one company has all the solutions. So it's best to have opportunities where we're bringing different resources, different people together to solve some of these problems. One of the things that has really worked that I've seen in the last 2 years that I was uniquely involved with is the HBCU Technology Conference, because what they did was having what they call CEO panels, forums every Friday or every other Friday, where communities that they were trying to reach were a part of the conversation. So we were telling them the things and the challenges we were having, from in the classroom to, in leadership and different things. And they took all that information and helped to inform what a technology conference would look like for the community in which they're serving. And because of that, it was so successful that they expanded into a second year and even making that a big priority moving forward, just because they allowed the communities in which they were trying to help be a part of the solution. They allowed them to say, you may think you want to do that because you're already doing it in your organization, but that's not what we need. Here's what we need. We need a Future of Work Academy for our students to be able to engage in this. We need our students to be champions on our campuses. So the students are the ones leading the conversation on the campuses. It's harder to get the faculty buy-in, but also bring our leadership a part of the conversation. Have a session just for leadership, so they too can understand why this is important in the organization. There's one thing I often say is that we don't have to solve everything. There are people who think, oh, I have to solve all of this, EDI issue. I got to make sure everybody has access. And what are all the things I can do? No, it's one thing at a time in most cases. And it's one organization at a time, meaning that in your own environment and in your own organization, ask yourself, what is it that I can do to effect change? And you may not be the CEO, you may not be the VPR, you may just be a person in an office that sees stuff that are happening that are not inclusive enough. What can you do, and who can you have as an ally to help you build the things that needs to be built to support the entire ecosystem? So never think that you have to do it alone. Never think that you're going to solve all the problems, and definitely do not come in with a savior mentality. Right? Bring those people a part of the conversation and listen to them and see what their problems are. And so that's what I would say. It's a work in progress. It's happening. And I'm hopeful that in the near future that we will see a truly inclusive innovation ecosystem where all the players, whatever is representative of what America and the world looks like, would be a part of the solution.
Great. Thank you so much. Victor, turning toward a little bit more on the entrepreneurship side of business startup side, what are the most significant barriers that need to be removed in order to enable more diverse populations to start their own businesses, particularly in high-tech industries and other innovation-centric industries?
Well, a lot of people look for that silver bullet, like that one thing that you can do. And the challenge is that entrepreneurs digest of 1,000 cuts, right? There's so many things that get in the way of starting a business. And so the key is really to look at how do you remove 1,000 cuts? And those 1,000 cuts come from many different aspects. So one of the common ones, for instance, people look at is capital access, which comes from whether you're starting a business in your basement or whether you're starting a high-tech business spinning out of university. And one of the great challenges of capital access is how do you solve a problem of capital access from a policy level or systemic level? And what usually happens is that we think of subsidies to try to create more funding systems to try to get more businesses formed. And the challenge with that is it's sort of an endless, need, right? There's so much need for people of underserved backgrounds to start these businesses. And what usually doesn't happen often enough is to think about, well, where are all the places where we're actually taking money away from them to keep them from starting a business? So I'll give you one instance. The World Bank, according to the World Bank, it costs over $700 just in terms of fees to start the average business in America. And so when you think about the population where half of Americans, including a lot of grad students, don't have much savings. They have less than like a couple of months of savings in their pockets. $700 actually is exclusionary. It actually keeps people out of starting a business. It actually becomes money that they could put towards, their prototype or their first seed idea or that patent filing or just getting that basic idea off the ground or lab rental or something like that, or supplies. And so we don't think about capital access in the sense of, well, what are we taking out of people's pockets? But if you look at the way that businesses are formed, so if you look at Black businesses, for instance, they start with 1/10 of the capital and they grow at a fraction of the speed of non-Black businesses. Businesses owned by women start with about half the capital of businesses started by men, and they grow at about half the speed. We know that entrepreneurial access is actually constrained by wealth. And so those who have wealth have the ability to pay the $700 fee. They have the ability to create their own seed capital. They can tap their friends and family networks easily to get that seed money. But those that don't. And so the question is, how do you get that flywheel spinning to build intergenerational wealth that can actually seed the future access to entrepreneurship, whether it's a high-tech tech transfer business spinning out of a top research university or something else. And the key is to look at it as a whole systemic process. So if you look at it from the perspective of the entrepreneur or the user or the postdoc or the student that's trying to build something or the professor who's trying to spin something out of their university. And I've done that before. I've worked with professors and spun technology businesses out of universities. And it's all the same. Basically, at the core, it's a fundamentally universal experience, which is you need access to capital, you need access to right people, you need access to the ideas, you need the resources to grow. And you want to bring down all the frictional barriers that actually get in the way of causing that to happen. And so when we think about things like frictional barriers, those are those issues like Almisha and Catherine are working on, is how do you connect people to the right resources? How do you make sure they're surrounded 360 degrees by the people and the services they need? But you can also think of the systemic policy infrastructure, which is how do you remove all the different costs and wait times and barriers and forms to fill out and fees to pay and people that have power over you that actually don't understand your business or they don't understand the opportunity that actually become a hindrance to you starting a business. And so every $700 fee that gets assessed, every 1 week you have to wait for someone to make a decision for you to do your thing, it all adds up, right? Those are the 1,000 cuts that actually hinder entrepreneurial activity. And so what we have not looked at is those 1,000 cuts and looking across the entire entrepreneurial experience and trying to tackle them. And so that requires a rethink from the top down about what is the user experience of someone trying to create value, whether it's spinning out a new tech company from university, laboratory bench, or whether it's a student trying to start a new business out of the dorm room. It's a universal set of experiences in the sense that people need the same access to the resources that people and the capital needs to build these businesses. And we have not really prioritized that as a whole.
Great, thank you. Almisha, from a tech transfer perspective, what do you see as barriers that need to be addressed?
I think it's for tech transfer. Of course, there's not a lot of minorities in the field of tech transfer. It's one of those things where I often struggle with, and how do we do that? So we've done a number of things, from partnering with large institutions, like the whatever organization that wants to help. For me, when I started in tech transfer, I literally was thrown into tech transfer and had to swim through it and figure out, how do I make this work, right? I'm a person who will never said no to something if it's a challenge. I saw it as a challenge and decided that I wanted to learn this and I wanted to see how to be successful. Don't have a STEM degree, as you heard my stuff, marketing, mass communication, public policy, but I figured that it was a challenge. And when I first got involved, I didn't see much people look like me. And the one person that I saw look like me, I decided to, ask the person, can I come to your office and shadow you for about a week? That turned into a long-term relationship with that individual that I consider that person a mentor of mine. But I decided that what can I do to ensure that we have a more inclusive system when it comes to tech transfer, and began to do a lot of work in that space and finding the partners that were willing to really help in that ecosystem. So I've worked with federal labs in terms of getting students to intern. In fact, yesterday we interviewed our first fellow for our Army Corps of Engineer lab here in Vicksburg, Mississippi. So they'll be starting in the spring. Also started some stuff with folks at Princeton, started some stuff as well with some other institutions to say, hey, I want my students to be able, whether or not they end up in the career of tech transfer, I want them to know what it is and what they're working, what this entails, and because it's applicable to any environment that they find themselves in for work or whether they're doing their own entrepreneurial entity. And so what I see is that a lack of intentional effort, in some cases, to involve different people in those spaces. But I also have to give credit to those that I've seen that doing some work like WashU, I see them do their program to ensure that they're upskilling not just people of color, but different types of marginalized community, women in particular, to make sure they're involved in the space. I have a program funded by the National Science Foundation trying to put a face to entrepreneurship and innovation within the minority population, women, showcasing them, putting an entire messaging campaign around that, hey, there are people out here who are actually doing it. They're just not visible. And sometimes we hear people in minority populations say, I don't see anyone that look like me doing it. And so that's an intentional effort to showcase that, because I know people who are in the space, they're just more in the background stuff. They're not visual. And so we wanted to highlight those people. But also, I would say that the collaborations, I'm very thankful for the collaboration of folks at, for example, University of Kentucky, some of the partnerships with the USPTO and others that are reaching out and saying, what can we do to help? Right. And so helping to form some of those programs to assist us to move the narrative along, to move the needle in somewhere. And like I said, I'm highly hopeful and optimistic about what the future would look like. I see our students engaging more. I see our community coming in and asking questions. So we have our students working along with them. I see the Center for Innovation that we have here on our campus doing great things and empowering our students to get involved in these spaces. And so I'm very, very hopeful. I'm thankful for a lot of the work. I was just about to text Catherine and Victor in the chat and said, I'm truly appreciative of the work that you're doing in your various ecosystems. And however we can partner to move this along, even at a more faster pace and making sure it's intentional, I'm here to support that. I'm here to connect you with some of those communities. So thank you so much. And Tom, again, thank you for this opportunity as well.
Well, thank you, Amisha. I tell you what, we're near the end of our time, but I want to do one sort of maybe lightning round, hopefully kind of fun question for you all. That would be really helpful. Helpful for our audience. Imagine that you're the CEO of your favorite high-tech company or industry. In the last decade or so, probably 2 decades, really, the Business Roundtable invented, and many companies started to set aside parts of their budget for something we called corporate social responsibility, to make an impact on some of these issues that we've addressed in today's panel. You're the CEO. Very quickly, tell us, what would you do with your CSR budget to build more inclusive opportunities in a high-tech economy? And Catherine, I'll start with you.
Wow, that's quite a question.
Very quickly, give me 20 seconds of.
And do you mean within the organization, within the community? within the community.
It's your budget. What would you do?
I would put a lot of money into educating some of the more powerful leaders and getting their buy-in into working on their own organizations.
Great. Victor, what about you?
The lesson from Silicon Valley is that great companies thrive, like HP thrived by actually expanding its reach to bring in entrepreneurs. They let employees go to start businesses that would become suppliers back to the company. They'd buy companies that would become part of the supply chain of HP. They'd spin stuff off that would become its own enterprise. So breaking down the barriers between what's the large corporation and the innovative businesses, making those barriers permeable, diversifying supply chains so it includes new companies that are innovative and on the cutting edge, actually makes the big companies more successful.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Campbell, very quickly,
I'll create a committee of entrepreneurs from the community and students, especially from the K to 12, especially high school and middle school. I'll bring them in for them to give ideas back to the company about how they would like to see the ecosystem develop over time.
Great, wonderful. Well, we've come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank our three panelists, Dr. Almisha Campbell from Jackson State University, Victor Huang from Right to Start, Dr. Catherine Ashcraft from the National Center for Women in Information Technology. Thank you all for your wonderful comments today.
Hello, everybody. My name is Andre Yanku. I'm a partner at Tyrell in Manila, and I'm a former director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. I'm very excited to be part of this CSIS conversation regarding diversity of innovation and what we all can do to increase the participation of all Americans in the innovation economy. I am joined by two wonderful panelists and important members of the intellectual property ecosystem, Michelle Saxena and Barbara Fiacco. I'll introduce each one in turn, but let me start with Michelle, and I'll ask each one of them to say a few words before we get going with a conversation. But Michelle is a senior research economist at the U.S. PTO, where she is focused on the economic impact of inclusivity of underrepresented groups in the IP ecosystem, using microeconomics and applied microeconomics methods. I suspect she will tell us all about those techniques and the types of research the office has been undertaking on these issues in recent years. Prior to working at the USPTO, Michelle was a research economist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and in particular in the Economic Research Service in the Food Economics Division. Michelle holds a PhD in agricultural, environmental, and development economics from the Ohio State University, a master's from Johns Hopkins University, and a BBA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Michelle, welcome. And let me turn it over to you, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the work you and the office, the PTO in general, have been doing on these issues.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great introduction. Sometimes I forget all the things that I've gone through to get to this spot.
Well, it's very impressive.
Thank you. So my research is really part of USPTO's overall desire to improve representation in patenting. And really my role in this kind of bigger goal is to study and really document that progress. So that's what I've been doing. I've been with PTO for about 3 years now. And so over the 3 years that I've been here, I've been involved in basically 3 really major reports. The first one, and I'm going to go chronologically, is called the Progress Potential Report. All three of these, the theme between all three of them is to really capture the state of female inventorship in the United States. So the first one, which is called Progress Potential, we use data that goes up to 2016. So those are all statistics that I'll talk about that's relative to 2016. Then we followed that up with an update, also called Progress and Potential Update, and that essentially extends the data to 2019, so it's much more contemporary. And then this final report that I published last month basically is an extension of that update. We essentially look at geographic representation at a more granular level, so at the county level. And we were really interested in sort of not only just giving statistics about how many women inventors exist in the United States, but also some of the kind of environmental and economic determinants that promote inventorship. So from here on out, I'm going to give you a little bit of the kind of statistics and to kind of set the groundwork for what we'll be talking about. And I'm sure all the people on this call are quite familiar with it. But basically that first report that covers 2016, essentially the biggest statistic that came out of that was that only 13% of the inventor corpus is women. And so if we look at the data that we can use, that's actually usable in a statistical sense, that starts in the mid-70s. And so we know in the mid-70s that only women inventors only represented about 5% of inventors at that time. And so over the course of, over 30 years, there has been a tremendous amount of growth. It's over 150% amount of growth. The problem is that it's grown to 13%, and obviously there's this huge issue with gender parity or lack of gender parity. And so some technology fields have been better at representing women than others. In particular, biotech and pharmaceuticals and chemistry have had higher representation of women. So to be more specific, in those fields, the women's inventor rate, which tells you the share of unique women for a given time. For biotech, it was 25% in 2016. In pharmaceuticals, it was 23%, and then in chemistry, it was 21%. The problem is that there are other fields that don't have that great representation, and mechanical engineering is the one that kind of sticks out the most. Their women's inventor rate really hovers around 8 to 10%, and that's still current. We also know that women tend to invent from universities and like public research institutions, which is really great. But the problem with that is, and they're also underrepresented in firms. The problem is that most patents are granted to firms. So there's this really structural hurdle that women are patenting in places that just don't have as much share of the sort of patenting market. There are, of course, signs of improvement. So when we look at the newest cohort of inventors, if we only look at those inventors, so inventors who've invented for the first time, like in the last 5 years, the women's inventor rate among that cohort is 17%. So it's clearly getting better with younger and younger inventors. It's just that we have a lot work to do. And then among those new inventors, they actually, this is sort of the statistic that we have that shows the most parity, is that among new inventors, they tend to patent again at similar rates for both men and women. And so that's a really great signal. That's a really great sign that this new crop of inventors are continuing to stay in the system, and it doesn't seem to be deterred by their gender. So that's a really great statistic. We really like to sort of tout that one. And then this last report that we did, we really wanted to look at, so prior to that report, we could say, general statements like, oh, California has a lot of inventors, Massachusetts has a lot of inventors. But California, in particular, California is a very big state. So it's not like all these inventors are evenly distributed across the state. We wanted to look at where are the epicenters of invention, particularly in terms of the representation of women. And what we find is, of course, those really large cities that are synonymous with big tech are producing a lot of women inventors. But we actually found that over the 30 years, there's increased geographical representation. So not all of the technology activity is happening in these sort of large big tech cities anymore. It really has become more democratized over time, which is a great, also a great signal, and provides more opportunities for more people across the country. So that's kind of a general, summary of all three of those really large reports. I wouldn't be a good statistician, I wouldn't be a good econometrician if I didn't state my sources. So all of the patenting data comes from PatentsView, which is a USPTO data set. That's where basically we get all of our gender attributed data. So if you are familiar with PTO, we're not allowed to collect any demographic data. We have to predict it, and we predict it using really complicated name algorithms. But that data we do it, it's a lot of work, and we provide it to the public, and that's how we were able to basically do all of these three studies. And then the sort of environmental and economic factors, those data come from our kind of other commerce buddies. So we get income data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. We use labor force statistics from BLS, and then educational attainment, which we have found to be very, very strongly correlated with women inventorship. We get that from census data. So that'll leave it with that, and we can start having a discussion about this really great topic.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Thank you for the explanation. Those reports are phenomenal in my view, all of them. And the work the PTO has done is groundbreaking on these issues and illuminating to a degree that has not been made clear before to the public. Obviously, for a long time, folks had a gut feeling about the participation levels, but putting numbers behind it and systematically analyzing them is really so important to being able to even begin to have and offer solutions to some of these issues. So I have a lot of questions for you about those reports.
Sure.
But speaking about potential solutions and how industry is responding, let me turn first to Barbara Fiacco. Barbara is co-chair of the patent litigation practice at the law firm of Foley and Hoag, and represents generally life sciences companies and research institutions in complex intellectual property and in particular patent litigation matters. She has represented leading pharmaceutical and life sciences clients in multiple significant patent infringement lawsuits, and also represents clients in other IP areas such as trade secret, inventorship, tech transfer issues, and other types of commercial litigation. Barbara is a past president of AIPLA, the American Intellectual Property Law Association, and a past president of the U.S. section of the International Association for the Protection of Intellectual Property. When she was president of AIPLA, it coincided with my term at the USPTO. So I got to work with Barbara in that role extensively. And I'm familiar with the phenomenal work that she does for the IP system in general, but also her focus on diversity of innovation as well. So Barbara, let me turn it over to you and talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about We've heard the statistics from Michelle with respect to women inventors. But what's the perspective from industry, from a law firm perspective, from companies' perspectives on these issues, and what is being done or can be done about it?
Sure, thanks very much. I thought I'd start with the perspective of the IP bar, which is one that probably haven't heard much from today, and give you some statistics about where we stand in the intellectual property bar. This is based on 2019 statistics from the AIPLA survey, and it's maybe a little better than the inventor statistics that Michelle just gave you, but maybe I'll leave that for you to judge. It depends, I think, on the demographic we're looking at. So based on that survey, where the intellectual property bar, which is broader just for purposes of our discussion today, broader than just registered patent attorneys and agents, but it's about 20% women, or was in 2019, 1.7% Black or African American practitioners, 1.9% Latino, 5.6% Asian Pacific Islander. So we're not a diverse profession by any stretch of the imagination. I've also seen some independent data from a law firm that mined some patent databases and identified that only about 2.2% of registered patent practitioners in 2019 were racially diverse women. So as an ecosystem, we all need to improve. And I think that the patent bar associations certainly recognize the importance of providing resources to inventors, including underrepresented inventors, to access the patent system in a way that more fully than they have, including by thinking about, do their lawyers look like these scientists and engineers, to help them access the patent system, to help them understand the innovation community. So first I'll talk a little bit about what efforts are being made to diversify the patent bar. And then we can talk about the collaborations that the bar has had both with the patent office and with industry. So starting out by looking at the pipeline, we're working with the same pipeline that Michelle's inventors are working with. It's the STEM community, college students, and from a law firm perspective or a practitioner perspective, there's a lot of effort being given to reach out to diverse college students in the technical fields and encourage them to consider the practice of patent law as a career opportunity. It's not something that a lot of people have heard about in college, and law school itself is a big bar. The debt that one can incur from obtaining a law degree could be a substantial hurdle to entering the profession. So one thing that the bar associations have done is that the ABA IPL section and AIPLA founded and are supporting a foundation for the advancement of diversity in IP law, and recognizing that we need to reach down to the college level and identify law schools as an opportunity for them. The foundation has revamped its scholar program, and so now they're going out to colleges and encouraging diverse STEM students to consider law school, assisting them with the law school admission process, generally raising awareness about the profession, and then supporting them through scholarships, mentoring, formal mentoring programs, other programs, as well as internship matching. So the idea is to provide, a full set of resources to assist STEM students through law school and into the patent practice. Likewise, there are law firms that have a lot of diversity programs that they're working on, particularly in the IP context. So that's a bit about the pipeline. The pipeline has traditionally been pretty narrow, right? I've referred to STEM students over and over again as the individuals who are qualified to sit for the patent bar. The PTO has, over recent years, really focused on potentially expanding that pipeline, including to expand the diversity of the bar itself. which is helpful in the recruitment process and developing the private practitioners. And so there's been a look, I think in 2020, there was a look at expanding the definition of the relevant majors, scientific majors or degrees that could allow one to be qualified to sit for the patent bar. There's consideration now about expanding that again, and also having the PTO look every 3 years or so at which degrees should qualify. And there's a recognition that technology is ever changing and majors and degrees are changing, and the PTO needs to keep up with the innovation that's happening on the education side. And then also a conversation that the PTO has started about expanding who might be eligible to sit for the design patent bar, which of course is a different notion than a utility patent and can certainly expand. And I think the thought is that it might really expand the diversity of people eligible to sit for that. So that would bring in more qualified practitioners, including into firms and to work with inventors. That's bringing people into the pipeline and expanding what the pipeline could be. There are retention and advancement issues that go along once you recruit the candidates and the young lawyers into the firms. Many firms have training and mentoring programs. There are women and diversity initiatives that I think have really taken hold over the years. There's unconscious bias training. But I will say, and this is really, law firms can be very reactive as organizations. And what can really help is outside external pressures. And so clients, industry can really help drive home that process, including through, we've seen an increase in inquiries associated with RFPs about diversity programming, diversity initiatives, diversity of the legal team, requirements about the diversity of a given legal team that's supporting a client. And that's all part of the hiring process that has become increasingly important. And when you impose those requirements on a law firm, you're going to start to see some real results. And I think that has led to some real advances over the years. And it's been refined from, I think, initial programs or RFP processes where there might have just been kind of a high level, check the box, diversity inquiry, with clients now really drilling down and asking the question about who's actually doing the work, once you've won the RFP, who's spending the hours on my cases, who's getting the billing credit for promotion, for purposes of promotion and compensation. And once the curtain is pulled back on that, I think, I've seen some real advancement across, the industry where clients are getting involved at that level to make sure that that the diverse attorneys are being promoted within the organization and recognized for their efforts. Another external pressure that can really help both clients and law firms in the context of IP practitioners, patent practitioners, are programs like we've seen in district courts and like the PTO has, the LEAP program, which is intended to give junior attorneys the opportunity to argue before the PTAB. So that's a really interesting program. Junior lawyers who've done fewer than 3 substantive arguments are eligible to participate, and they're given 15 extra minutes for arguments, and the opportunity for a senior lawyer to jump in if necessary, although I haven't heard of that happening. So it's the program's a couple years old, and I just looked up the statistics earlier, and they've had, as of August, 135 junior attorneys had participated in that. So that's a very nice way for both the client and a law firm to get behind opportunities for junior and often underrepresented associates to develop really important training so they can advance. So that's the focus from the bar perspective. I think we could talk generally a little later, Andre, about sort of the way the bar has been partnering with both the PTO and clients and industries, but I'll stop there for now.
Fascinating. Lots of activity for sure, and the bar is definitely paying attention, and the bar organizations, industry organizations are attending to this issue. But let me ask a question about your statistics, which sound terribly low, especially when you're going beyond. I mean, 20% women as part of the IP bar, that is low. But then when you get to racial minorities, those numbers that you mentioned, 1.7, 1.9%, are remarkably low. But I have a question on that. You said that those numbers are not just patent lawyers, right? They're just IP lawyers in general. So they include trademark lawyers and copyright lawyers, because those professions do not require a STEM degree. But you're saying that those numbers are just as low in those professions?
Are the statistics from 2019 from the AIPLA survey. Yes.
All now, combined.
Like everything else, there are self-reporting and selection issues that, we would need to try to get behind, but those are the numbers reported. Yes.
Yeah. And Michelle, the PTO's studies are, as far as I know, and I think what you mentioned, are exclusively looking at women inventors. Has the PTO looked at racial minority inventors?
Yeah, I actually really like talking about this subject. We did. We had this workshop. Essentially, the hurdle is that we aren't allowed to collect demographic data. And the reason why, the work is mostly in gender right now, it has the most traction, is because it's much easier to predict gender of individuals based on their name. There's a lot of information in a person's name. The problem with race is that that isn't necessarily the case. Will Smith, who is, obviously a Black actor, from his name, there's no way that an algorithm could predict that that man is a Black man. So we are currently trying to figure out how to do a racial attribution, because we don't have that data yet. And the progress that we have made is that we had this workshop. We brought together other government institutions. So CFPB, they do audits of mortgage lending and banks. And Medicare, they use racial attribution algorithms to produce the statistics on racial inequalities, particularly in housing and in health. So we are looking into adapting those algorithms to the patent data. Of course, it is, the problem is with that is that the existing algorithms don't allow you to predict race at the individual level. So you can say this population is likely to be 20% Black. That's what the CFPB and Medicare algorithms, that's as far as they get you. The problem is that we actually do want to know, what is the state of, Black inventors? What is their representation within the corpus? And so we're kind of at this cusp where there are other, more sophisticated models out there, but they haven't been endorsed by any other government institutions. So we would be like the first people to do that. And that's kind of scary. And we are obviously trying to tread lightly, but it's certainly, I had a meeting with somebody at Colorado University, and we're, trying to get this ball rolling and trying to, be able to provide that type of information to the public. And it's just an understudied topic that we would really like to, dive into. So
Now, of course, there is some pending legislation that would expressly give the USPTO the ability to collect demographic data on a voluntary basis from its applicants, and that's called the IDEA Act. Do either one of you are you familiar with this, and are you able to talk about it?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. We, in terms of, our participation, we have the first survey ready to go. We've, had it looked at. It's, I've have my own contribution to the questions that we want to ask there. It's ready. We're just really waiting on Congress to allow us to actually collect the data. So, it's sort of I think at this point, we're in a better spot to pursue the racial algorithm path than to wait for this IDEA Act to actually implement it, and we can actually, collect data from that. Whenever we get that data, though, I would be happy to write 1 million papers and talk about it. So.
Well, adapting a Churchill saying, Congress eventually acts and passes a bill when all other options have been exhausted.
Yeah.
So I guess we're not quite at that point yet, but the IDEA Act is bipartisan, is bicameral, and we actually had a program at CSIS about a year ago where one of the original authors of the act, Senator Hirono from Hawaii, spoke, and we had a conversation about it and surrounding issues. So that program is available on the CSIS website if folks are interested. Now, let's talk a little bit about the pipeline. Michelle, Barbara, you mentioned that there is a pipeline issue when it comes to STEM. And I know, for example, that about 50% of jobs in the United States, give or take, are staffed by women. And despite that, only about 25% of STEM jobs are staffed by women. So there's no question that there is a pipeline issue when it comes to graduating folks with the appropriate STEM degrees and whatnot, and then getting them hired into those positions. So there's definitely a pipeline issue when it comes to the science and technical world, which is relevant to patents, not so much trademarks and copyrights. But then, turning to you, Michelle, despite the fact that about 25% of jobs are staffed by women, your reports show that only 12 or 13% of women, of inventors named on patents are women. Yeah. So therefore, that's not a pipeline issue, is it? In other words, those folks are already in the seats, yet they appear on patents at about half the rate, evidently, if it's 25% going down to 12 or 13% in rough numbers. So what's going on there?
Yeah, so I would actually argue that's still part of the pipeline. Clearly, there's this huge leakage within the work environment. So we're getting all of these women, and I think actually those statistics have been updated. So I think last time we looked, about 34% of STEM degrees were awarded to women. And then of those, the curve, like you said, there's a very low conversion rate. Of those, only about 13%, 14% women go on to patent. And so, this is something that has been, it's a current huge topic within kind of economics and sociology. Like, what is going on in the work environment that deters women who already are educated and, are capable of inventing? Why are they not inventing? And so really, I mean, the literature that comes to mind is by this professor called Jennifer Hunt. She's in Rutgers University. And so, she basically states that the work environment in these sort of patenting intensive firms is somehow, inhospitable to women inventors, and it's deterring. There's also literature that shows that, in, markets or labor markets where there is considerable gender disparity, that having a really discrete like promotion steps is really helpful for women. And so in places where, patenting, the conversion from patenting to professional development is a little bit more nebulous, that seems to be deterring for women. And so, those are all kind of factors, but really the simple answer is we don't actually really know. We haven't really studied it that well. Jennifer Hunt is really kind of the only person who's been doing it. And the problem is, it's not that, we're incapable of studying those subjects. It's just that we don't have access to that data.
When you say we, you mean from the government side?
No, I mean it from the government side and from, the firm side. It's really hard to get HR data with all, I mean, it should be, right? Like, you shouldn't be able to have that type of data, just accessible. But the problem is we need that to be able to actually study any of these kind of mechanisms within the firm. And so like I said before, we just don't really know. It's kind of a vacuum. We would really like to know. A part of Patent's View, which is the data set that we curate, is that it's actually probably one of the only places where, if you're working at a firm, you can actually look up, the individual inventors and how many of those people are women. It's very hard to find that information even within your firm. And so that has really just kind of been a huge hurdle in terms of understanding why there's this huge leakage at the end of the patenting ecosystem. So.
Yeah, well, the PTO does have a relatively new council, and I think it's currently called the Council for Innovation Inclusion. It used to be called the National Council for Expanding American Innovation, and they're on this council, they're CEOs of many top companies, some professors and other folks, as well as members from industry. And I think, Barbara, you're on, or yes, you're still on, at least you were, and I guess you're still on this council. One of the goals of this council is to provide some guidelines and potential action items for the United States to take here. Maybe the council, and maybe you can talk a bit about this, Barbara, maybe one of the things to look at is what Michelle has just identified. How, since these major companies are on this council, what role can they play to help economists and folks, studying these issues, identify the real problems? Because the fact is, you just simply, I don't think you can solve these problems if we don't understand the real causes and at what levels the problems occur. But I don't know, is the council looking into some of this? Do you know? And is it possible to ask industry to report out on some of these things?
I'm not sure exactly where the council stands on that at the moment. I mean, I do think that there are a lot of people talking about it, and actually some of Michelle's data that I think is really interesting that could be drilled down on further, where there's there's industry breakdowns, which you mentioned, Michelle. And one other thing that I think is interesting is that I believe, if I remember correctly, the data suggests that there are more women inventors when there's a larger sort of joint inventorship team. and fewer like single women inventors like standing alone. And you wonder, there's probably like deeper, if you could get some company data, it would be very interesting to see, is that a function of women working in industries like life sciences, where there tends to be more larger research teams, where one would inevitably expect to see more women on those teams, more women named on patents, or whether there's like something else going on. So within the life sciences space, right, it would be interesting in a given firm to see, are there also patents where there's one or two named inventors, and are those women as well or not? If you sort of,
Sure.
there's a lot of really interesting ways the data could cut there, and if we could get some more out of industry, I think that it would be really useful. I want to pivot a bit to just say, IPO, the Intellectual Property Owners Association, their women's committee has put together a toolkit to assist their members and really the public, anyone who's interested in taking on this issue, and in particular the gender disparity around inventorship, and have kind of a series of steps to sensitize and kind of try to change a culture within an organization to think through some of the gender disparity issues and some of the unconscious bias issues. I mean, this is sort of where science meets kind of people, right? And when you think about the inventorship standard and somebody making, an individual is an inventor if they've made sort of an inventive contribution, a not insignificant contribution to, an element of a claim in a patent. And when you overlay that with what we know exists in unconscious bias, so if you take that concept and you just put, the story that we've all heard about the group of people in a meeting and a woman makes a suggestion, and then, 5 minutes later, a man makes the same exact suggestion and it gets recognized in a way that the woman's same suggestion 5 minutes earlier hadn't been recommended. You sort of wonder how that overlay works in the context of a research team. And so one of the suggestions in the IPO toolkit is thinking about unconscious bias as it relates to those conversations around innovation and invention. So I think there's so many different facets of this problem that can be tackled all at the same time. And I do think that a lot of different stakeholders are aligning on this to try to fix the problem or mitigate the problems.
I will say, I'm also part of the CI squared, kind of in the background. I'm always the one kind of putting together the agendas and moderating those meetings that we had. And I will say that from, on the USPTO side, it's just, if I could kind of wave my hand and do whatever I want.
Oop. You want to unmute?
Can you hear me now? Yeah. If I could do whatever I wanted and I could just, order people around, I would just have, all the companies that are part of CI squared share their data with us. And obviously there are a lot of hurdles to that. But I think actually, I keep talking about PatentsView, but it actually really is a great resource. You can look up your firm and find all that gender relevant data. And of course, it's not 100%. It's created by an algorithm, but it's really the only place that I know that has centralized information on firms where you can find, gender data. And hopefully, the plan is to extend that to racial data as well.
And you report on that, right? Like the biggest entities, I think research institutions and companies with the most.
Yeah, we have like a top 30
patents. Yeah. And some of those organizations have been recognized, including by bar associations for their work to.
Yeah. I think it's a lot of coordination, right? It's a huge coordination issue. And I think that's why CI2 was created in the first place, was to kind of create this, centralized place where we could talk about diversity and how, as like a community and as a market, we could improve representation. You know, there's, at least from the data side, which is what I specialize in, it's just hard to coordinate that level of information sharing across firms. And so I think, you know, that has just been, my experience has been that, you know, when you actually talk to somebody who's representing that corporation, you know, there's obviously a hesitancy to share that type of information. And I don't think that that's going to change anytime soon. And so you know, our status is to look to other ways to kind of measure the state of, you know, female representation. So
just to put, for the audience, just to put things in context here, why this is so important. Obviously, it's important on an individual basis for everybody to have equal access to our system and being able to participate. But two really important things. First of all, we know also from PTO studies that employees in IP-intensive industries make approximately 50% more in income than employees in the general economy. There's no question that, you know, if you're patenting, if you're contributing new ideas, other forms of IP, it's better for your personal career advancement, satisfaction, and so on and so forth. But it's hugely important for the United States as well. There's a 2018 study from Harvard by Alex Bell and some others studying similar issues on the diversity of inventors across the United States. And it concludes, and I'm paraphrasing, but it concludes that if all Americans were to participate at the same levels that the current inventors are at, we can quadruple the number of inventors in the United States and make a huge impact on our GDP. So it's for many reasons, it's important for the individuals, for the companies, communities, and the United States in general. In any event, so one hurdle, anecdotally at least, Barbara, is that inventors that inventors that are not exposed to folks that have similar experiences and the like are more reluctant to come forward. And again, anecdotally, at least, as far as I know, companies that have more women patent lawyers, as an example, are able to extract invention disclosures from women scientists and engineers at a higher rate. Maybe you can talk a bit about that. My data for this is purely anecdotal. I don't know if there are any studies on this, but it seems to make sense. Do you have a similar experience? And if so, what can the bar do to increase more diversity in, for women patent lawyers and racial minority patent lawyers, which probably will translate at least to a higher rate of patenting by those groups?
That's a great question. I'm hopeful that just the way the IP bar helped clients advise on changing culture, to move maybe to a more patent protective, like to sensitize the need for patenting generally, as I've seen some clients over the years do, and work more closely with their IP counsel. I hope we're entering maybe the next stage of the innovation ecosystem development, where not only are IP lawyers more present generally with the scientists and researchers, but they can find ways, and we can work as a bar to ensure that we're approachable and look at drafts of patent disclosures and offer trainings to scientists about what inventorship means. It's different than we've all heard and have probably experienced the stories of people coming in with their list of inventors, as if it were a journal article, or other conventions that people took on that may have no legal significance, and just find ways to educate people about the patent process as well. I know the PTO has been thinking about it, and I've had conversations with different people at the PTO over time about how they've heard anecdotal stories as well about getting the first rejection, and how women inventors tend to walk away after they get their first rejection from the patent office, which you always get, right? And men will come back and not see that as defeat. And I think there's a lot of psychology around that as patent lawyers, we need to be there to assist, and support, and just collaborate with, I think, and be seen very much as a collaborator to assist with the process, and not an authority figure in and of ourselves, which I think is what can dissuade women and other underrepresented, scientists and engineers from participating even in the communications with, their lawyers, which is and then obviously, increased diversity of the legal departments and firms as well, because there will be times, no doubt, when someone will feel more comfortable approaching someone for advice and just that collaborative discussion, if the person looks like them, or someone, it reminds them of somebody they've interacted with in life, that they can really connect to.
There's so many issues here that it would take us the whole day to unpack, frankly, and probably not be done. But just on what you just mentioned, there's so many opportunities for additional statistical studies, Michelle. I have heard exactly what Barbara has mentioned, that women inventors give up more quickly during the prosecution of a particular patent application. They give up after the first office action more often than male inventors. So number one, I'm wondering if you've done a study on that. Seems to be data that's available. If you have data on women inventors, then you probably can figure out where in the process they give up as compared to the male inventors. But I have to say, to some extent, I don't know, Barbara, if that is an inventor issue. Most, there are over 700,000 applications every year, patent applications every year to the USPTO. The vast majority are represented by counsel, those applicants. And I just wonder if counsel is fighting as hard for their women clients as they're fighting for their male clients. Obviously, these are complex relationships, right? And the attorney-client relationship is complex. Each side pushes the other side a little bit further, or depending on circumstances. And there's a symbiotic relationship. But I wouldn't put it all on the inventors themselves.
I agree.
Because a lot of it is done by counsel.
I mean, you could even say, at least in larger institutions, that before outside counsel gets involved, and more often than not, I guess, with the larger institutions, it is outside counsel that's doing the prosecution work before the PTO. But there are decisions made within an institution about which invention disclosures get pursued. And we hear lots of anecdotal stories about, in particular, universities and research institutions where there's just a hierarchy in the faculty and who has the resources to spend of that institutions obtaining patents. And so I think it's really every step in the process. It would be really hard to know. And your comments sort of made me turn to Michelle and think, how could you even collect data on who the inventors or the patent prosecutors are, because in the face of the patent, sometimes it's a firm or it's maybe one or the selection of those lawyers listed on the face of the patent may not be necessarily the ones doing the work, behind the scenes for the for the application. That seems like a whole nother layer of data collection difficulty.
Well, I think the PTO does have data on the members of the patent bar. They can probably figure out who's male, who's female, and so on. They could probably match them up, but I don't know. I'm speculating. So since we
I can answer that question for you if you want.
Okay, exactly. So I should just ask questions instead of just pontificating speculative answers.
So going back to your first comment about where women inventors continue to persist in the innovation or in the patenting process, we ourselves haven't published a paper on it, but my co-author Gauri Subramani just published a paper on this exact issue, and she does find that there are statistical differences between men and women do drop off of the first action. And I don't have the exact reference right now, but I can certainly provide that to anybody who's interested. I think, though, the theme that I am hearing from Barbara, and actually somebody who was speaking in the previous session as well, is this idea of like, I want a patent with somebody who looks like me. I want to have a lawyer who looks like me. And like, what does that actually mean? It means that when you look at somebody, they look like you, it's signaling that we have this sort of shared experience and maybe even a shared set of values. And so I think, just as you said, Barbara, like it's hard to collect that kind of data, because really what we're trying to collect is this idea that if you look like me, then maybe you think the same things are important as I do. And maybe you're going to fight for my ideas because they're your ideas too, in a sort of shared experience kind of way. And it's really hard to collect that data. There's really no way. I mean, how would you discretize that kind of information is one thing. There's also the problem that like it's a numbers problem, right? Like the majority of inventors are men, and so even if you could collect this really nuanced social interaction type of data, it's still a really small set of the inventor corpus. So then, as a statistician, you have these issues of, well, is it really generalizable to the rest of the country or the rest of women in the United States? And so these are all really, really big questions that don't have a whole lot of easy solutions to kind of catalog the types of information that you need to answer them. And so it's just, I guess my last comment is that this is a really interesting and thought-provoking subject, and it's very worth investigating. It's just also very, very hard to quantify anything in this area. So
quick comment, and then we're running out of time, so I want to ask one more question before we wrap up. But the quick comment is that for IP litigation, at least anecdotally, there does seem to be more representation, at least from women lawyers in the patent litigation bar. It would be interesting to know what's the difference between those statistics versus the prosecution bar, and if something can be learned from the litigation side, because we're dealing with the same patents ultimately anyway, same technology. If in fact there is better representation on the litigation side, what can the prosecution side do to learn from that statistic? I don't know what the actual statistics are, and I don't know if anybody has done a study of the litigators. Do you, either one of you?
So I know that the AIPLA, I think Patent Litigation Committee has done a study at least of the demographics of the first chair lawyers, and who it is that's arguing in front of the jury or the judge who's doing the Markman hearings. That kind of a study, I don't have that data handy, but I think they've done it a couple of times now. That's of course different than the whole body of litigators, probably in much the same way that you would compare the body of prosecutors to those that appear before the PTAB, where I know there's definite gender disparities in particular.
And there are different issues that come up there as well. In any event, so let me finally turn to the regional distribution that is the subject of your latest report, Michelle.
Sure.
And whereas it does show increased geographic representation, as you mentioned in your opening comments, it's still concentrated. It's not evenly distributed across the United States. It's still highly concentrated, perhaps in more technology hubs than before, but nevertheless, it's concentrated around technology hubs. What conclusions should industry draw from that? Should would-be inventors and innovative companies locate in where the technology hubs are, or should the United States create more technology hubs? What does the data show? What would be better for economic growth in the United States and increasing participation in the innovation ecosystem?
Yeah, so this is a question that we talk about all the time. It certainly is not going to hurt you if you locate in Silicon Valley, if you want to patent. The research that we've seen, though, is that it's becoming less of a need to be kind of in these big tech areas. When we looked at the representation in the early 90s, of course, it's like Seattle, LA, San Francisco, Boston, New York, and DC were basically the only red spots. And now you can actually see that like middle-sized cities and places with really strong university presence are starting to show, a good amount of representation. And, in the early 90s, one of the, things that wasn't accessible was internet access, right? Like you had to actually physically be there. And now, this is a great example of technology helping technology. It's really, communication is really accessible to people across the country. And so I don't think the USPTO or the government can necessarily create a hub. You can't make something where it doesn't want to be, but it can certainly provide opportunities in places that are not Silicon Valley and places that are not Boston. And I think there are really qualified, apt inventors in the middle of the country that are waiting to have that type of opportunity. I don't think it's, you can't just pick a random county in the middle of the country and say, this is where we want the next hub to be. It's not quite that easy. But I think if you look at kind of these begrudging markets and these begrudging areas where there seems to be, more inventive activity, we can certainly bolster those places. And then, Silicon Valley doesn't happen in a vacuum. They are tied to other parts of the country. If when I was looking at the data, a lot of the inventor teams are still across the United States. There's like one inventor in Silicon Valley. There's one, in a research triangle in North Carolina. And so, there is like this networking effect. And I think, dropping investment and putting it into like the centroid of that, which would be, arguably Silicon Valley or Boston, depending on the type of technology. I don't think that really helps with, spreading innovation activity. I think there should be more investment in other places that maybe perhaps have already shown that they can handle the innovation activity, but haven't had as much like market exposure as like the really big tech places. So.
Well, thank you very much. Very thoughtful. Last word, Barbara, 20 seconds.
I guess coming off of the data in our conversation today, it's going to be a while before we have enough IP attorneys who look like the breadth of the inventor population that we would like to see. But just picking up on Michelle's comments, I think we just need to communicate to every burgeoning inventor that we believe in them and their invention and help empower them. And that seems to be whether or not we look like them, there's a human connection there to assist them. And just if you, whether you're a scientist or a lawyer or whomever you are, if you're underrepresented, and if you have someone who's believing in you, that can make all the difference in the world. So we can hopefully at least all make a difference in that little way as we chip away at the bigger problem.
Well, thank you both very much for this fascinating conversation. There is so much material here. The data from the USPTO, Michelle, is fantastic and really important. And the insights from industry, Barbara, are critical to understand what can be done to address all of these issues. There's no question that if we are to solve this, government and industry and academia need to work together to identify the problems and offer solutions. But thank you both very much for your insight and the work you do in these areas. And thank you to CSIS for putting this program on.
Thank you.
Thank
you.